Hey all, it's Ryder, and I hope you're stopping yourself from doom scrolling. This video is a bit different as I want to provide my perspective on ESO's history of progressively easier content and express my concern for ZOS's confusion of accessibility and sanitization. On your screen, I provided an overview of topics for today, as well as linked chapters for you to skip through at your leisure. So both in and out of games, accessibility has always been a really strong value of mine. To consider those who don't quite fit into the heteronormative category, often considered by developers of any kind. Within my work as an educator, it's imperative I account for several learning styles and balance adaptation with deliverance of accurate information. If I make my lessons hyper-specific and use language that prevents ESL learners from fully comprehending my words, then my message is less effective, and I could unintentionally bar students from reaching the same education as others who might be born into higher privilege. Applying this to ESO, there's many types of players who enjoy the same game we all do, but for one reason or another don't have the same access. Age, for example, is a common obstacle for a non-typical player, preventing an older player either socially through communication within communities like Discord servers, or physically through complex rotation management. Cognitive functions, such as those with autism, ADHD, or MS, are also barred either due to overstimulation, social cues, or expectations, as well as losing attention or other symptoms that disallow them to participate in all forms of the game, just as the rest of us can. More than that, players with limb differences may not be able to activate their abilities or move in the same way as a heteronormative player, and as such, find ways of adapting their playstyle. In all ways, accommodating these differences are vital for a diverse community and to provide the same human right to all players rather than catering to a select few. As I mentioned, accessibility is a really strong value of mine, and I seek to have a wide audience that can digest the same information as seen in our videos. It's important for changes in ESO to be proactive, for many of these groups can either feel powerless or voiceless to encourage change. Thus, it is the responsibility of those in power to assist those without. I've privately praised a lot of the changes ESO makes in order to make the game easier to understand, but I not only think they have a long way to go, but they're also losing sight of their vision in many ways. To explain, ZeniMax has approached this through a variety of ways, anywhere from similar cosmetics from hard mode clears being sold in the Crown store, crafted sets possessing the same power as trial sets, and rotations becoming easier. But for this video, I'm only focusing on the last part and how ZeniMax misunderstands the direction of accessibility and created a cyclical problem within their game. To demonstrate my point, let's examine data from several years ago. When my girlfriend, Rachel, first started the game, she had zero experience with any game ever. That said, I wanted to get her into my favorite love-hate game, and as such, I set her up with a Stamplar Jabs build. For those unaware, in 2020, Stamplars were seen as the accessibility option, possessing only a few dots, many passives, and a channeled spammable. At the time, Stamplars did comparable damage, probably having a maximum potential DPS on a dummy of around 70% of the average optimized build. If anyone needs a comparison, here's a parse I did on a Magsork in 2020 at the same time that she was doing her Stamplar. I brought her along to several veteran trials, and while her damage was not superb, she carried her weight in the runs and even out DPS'd some players with higher dummy parses than her, simply because she understood the mechanics more clearly and took actions to better herself. In this case, Rachel, though at a disadvantage due to her lack of experience in the game and setup, competed with players who had years of experience, not because of her build, but because of her determination to perform well. Her build wasn't created to be the best, but rather to grant her access to content that she was otherwise locked out of. Applying this to the modern context, we saw the release of the Arcanist, and with it, a similar playstyle to the classic Jab Stamplar. But here, ZOS's confusion with accessibility versus ease arises. Arcanists rely on their beam, a channeled effect that lasts up to 5 seconds, and a few long-lasting dots and passives on both bars. Look at the image on screen. They only have a few 30-second dots and a 15-second dot to keep up, and the rest of their bar are passives. Outside of that, you basically hit flail twice or thrice, and then beam. Repeat. The comparison between this and the classic Stamplar is clear. and given how Stamplars achieved most, but not all of the damage potential to an optimized setup, I expected Arcanists to fulfill the same niche. As we all know, however, this was not the case. Outside of few scenarios where single target is heavily preferred, like the Fire Dragon and Sunspire, Arcanists dominated the meta since their release. While I remained adamant to never play this class prior to subclassing, it's hard to admit that the class wasn't appealing. Within my trifecta group, I found myself trying to squeeze every second of damage perfectly just to stay ahead of the Arcanists. But while I strained to maximize every action performed, my team members had an entirely separate experience, as they executed a basically static rotation where only a few thousand DPS behind me. This wasn't on all fights, as I said, within the single target engagements allowing me to push ahead quite a bit on my Stamplar, but it always begged the question, why should I try so hard when I could input a fraction of the effort for effectively the same output? And is this what ZOS intended, for the accessibility option to become the best? Where once a setup was considered to be an accessibility option, a way of allowing atypical players into environments that previously restricted them, was now at the precipice of surpassing, of becoming stronger than the skilled options. Again, I think this misses the point of accessibility, and that the accessibility option should not be dominant by the heteronormative population. Subclassing acted as the tipping point, with homogeneity removing the need for unique setups. As in PvE, whichever setup does the most damage will always be the most desired. There's always the argument of play how you want, but if my classic Stamplar does 126,000 DPS, and my Arcanist Nightblade Templar does 160,000 DPS, why would I willingly take a 30% DPS loss when the Arcanist build is easier, more reliable, and survivable with a damage shield? Why would I keep up 5 dots, a dynamic burst with a bow proc, and execute rotation, when I can just hit 3 dots, flail, and beam for 4 to 5 seconds at a time? This brings me to my point of skill expression and identity in ESO, and how over-accessibility sanitizes the game. To maintain proper game balance, one needs not to look at power creep per se, but rather the relationship between ease and output. On your screen, I provided an image detailing some historic parses and what I categorize them to be the easiest to most difficult in terms of tiers 1 to 8, whereas 1 is the easiest and 8 is the most difficult. So as you can see, it's pretty linear, but Magsword was pretty easy and hitting pretty hard at the time. The ratio between difficulty and performance should remain relatively stable between one build and another to encourage a growth within the player. As seen, if the ratio is applied throughout the progression, players are linearly rewarded for their performance and better players feel accomplished. That said, this is where accessibility comes into play. Because these ratios only account for a normative audience, the ratio of difficulty to output must tip a favor towards the difficulty to match the disparity in performance naturally found within the gameplay. Or, in layman's terms, you need to make the build easier to do more damage for an accessibility option to account for the lack of normative ability. As such, the accessibility build would be easier to achieve comparable outputs, and we call this raising the floor. The issue we see today, however, is that the ratio of difficulty to output is weighed too heavily, and the output is far ahead of the effort required. The release of subclassing was intended to bring about diversity, but instead did the opposite, and exacerbated the problem of Arcanists dominating the PvE endgame, as every class line can easily be supplied by one subclass change, such as one player running Dawn's Wrath for the group, but still relying on beam and 3 dots to keep up their damage. The accessibility option is no longer just that, but rather the best in slot option in almost all scenarios, thus demonstrating ZOS's confusion between accessibility and ease of gameplay. When heteronormative players are using the options intended for those otherwise not as capable, the skill ceiling decreases and demotivates players to improve. For my PvP audience out there, we see this a lot with cross-healing, rewarding zerging and subclassing, allowing one-shots with incredible ease to pull off. ZOS is not naive as to these changes, as some are led to believe, but rather they understand and promote this direction, and this is evident through many additions to the game. While they may hide behind the shield of accessibility to justify their changes to the game, as seen with Oaken Soul and other accessibility options, the goal of accessibility is not being met, and is instead sanitizing possible options for players for skill expression, almost becoming the antithesis of their reasoning for subclassing. ZOS is wanting not to make the game more accessible for marginalized communities, but make the game easier for everyone. ESO is widely received as a game for casuals, and when the population of endgamers continues to decrease, ZOS continues to cater to the player base that pays and plays the most. Unfortunately, this is at the cost of endgame players, as mentioned within the death of skill expression. Moreover, ZOS tackles the issue of a dying player base by not only making content easier, but by essentially discouraging growth entirely. There are many rewards implemented into the game, either cosmetically or mechanically, that would make effort an inconvenience at best. If one were to spend any amount of time on Reddit, the forums, or any other social medias where players are free to express themselves, we notice a large portion of the community chastising endgame players for over-complaining, or in the very least not considering players who aren't able to achieve the same feats. To reiterate, I have no issue with players accessing content. However, this is no longer the discussion, and I fear ZOS has trained a vocal component of their player base to become entirely fragile and discount their own skills. There's been a lot of rhetoric and changes thrown around at the player base that don't promote their players to push ahead and become better at the game, but instead make the game so easy that overland content has become a joke by all members of the game. As a result, ZOS has trained fragility into their player base, and they lack all faith in their players to become better, which in turn doesn't allow people to actually challenge themselves. If the game doesn't have faith in you, why would you have faith in yourself? This is a concept known as fragility, and more specifically should be addressed through anti-fragility. In his book, Anti-Fragile: Things That Gain from Disorder, Nassim Nicholas Taleb argues that stress and difficulty create a more robust society and person, and the world should be built around this idea instead of sheltering. ESO instead hands rewards to players for participation, and does not ask them to step outside their comfort zone to acquire all that they desire. We continue to see more updates from ZOS that kind of push players to not try as hard, either through raising the DPS to insane levels, or making the gear easier or abilities easier, as I previously mentioned. In academics, we understand knowledge and skill are the rewards through entering the unknown world where effort is required to prevail. But when all that I desire is to be handed to me, why would I ever try to do anything else? So fixing the problem would require a shift in the game's philosophy, starting with establishing confidence back in the player base. In writing, we have to trust the readers to understand our subtext, just as ZOS needs to trust their player base to overcome challenges. If the games trust the people will trust themselves. We should realign the goals of accessibility with their intended outcomes rather than abuse them to serve an ulterior purpose, such as bringing more players to the game. When the easiest option becomes the best without comparison, there's no point in trying to become better, regardless if you fall into the heteronormative category or minority categories. Ultimately, and this is specifically to everyone watching this video right now, we must not turn on one another. Casual players and endgame players have valid concerns, but blaming one side or the other is not the true cause of our issues. While I disagree with many perspectives from the casual majority, that does not mean they're invalid, not by any means. We're all here to enjoy the game for different reasons, but our frustrations lie within ZOS and ZOS alone. We are capable of unifying our voices to promote the game's vision in a positive direction. And to ZOS, raise the floor, but do not drop the ceiling. A gap between the two must always exist to create interest in your game. For a game is a player's own story of growth, and a story without growth is boring and unreadable for a book, and unplayable for a game. If we want ESO's future to be prosperous, we must do better than what we currently have. And as always, to everyone watching, thank you very much, and make sure to stop doom scrolling. Seriously, it's rotting your brain and you only have one life. Have a great rest of your day.